Hi everybody, I'm Linda from Colourwerx Designs and welcome back to the Colourwerx Design House. This is week number 4 of the Feelin Groovy QuiltAlong, and this week we're all going to talk about learning technique number 3, which is paper piecing. We're going to work on making these spiky outer border units. These are paper pieced and I'm going to show you exactly the steps you need to do to accomplish that. If you're making the lap quilt, which is on the pattern cover, you're going to need to make 18 of these units. If you're doing the baby quilt like I am, you're going to need to make 12 of these units. So let's get started right away. First, you'll need to take the pattern insert page from your pattern, open it up to the spiky outer border pattern, and place this on your home printer to make copies. Use a cheap white Xerox paper, or you could use Carol Doak's foundation paper, which is specifically made for paper piecing. It's a thin beige paper that's sold at most quilt stores, and it makes it super easy to tear away once you're done stitching. Regardless, when you go to make copies on your home printer, make sure that you have your printer set for printing at 100% or printing at actual size. This is particularly important, especially for a paper piece pattern, because you need this shape to come out to the size you need to make the quilt top fit together when we put it together next week. Once you make one copy on your printer, go ahead and measure the 1-inch scale at the bottom to ensure that you're printing at full size. Do this by simply taking a ruler and placing it along the 1-inch scale right here. If it measures 1 inch, you are ready to go. You can also double check your pattern by measuring the actual pattern size. Within the dotted lines, it should measure 6.5 inches long by 9.5 inches wide. 6.5 by 9.5. Or double check that 1-inch scale at the bottom. Once you know that both those measurements are right on, go ahead and make as many copies as you need for the quilt size that you're making. Start by cutting yourself a variety of 3-inch by 8-inch blacks and whites, or black and whites and white and blacks. Here I just have a variety of black and whites from my stash, and again I have cut them at 3 inches by 8 inches. Next, let's familiarize ourselves with the pattern. This is a copy from my printer. You can see that you have printing on one side and nothing on the other side. The printed side is the side that we will sew on. The blank side is where we will place our fabrics in the sequence that is numbered here. So we'll start with number 1, which is a black piece. We'll go to number 2, which is a white piece. You'll also notice that there are solid lines that connect or come in between each one of the spikes, and they're labeled sew 1, sew 2, sew 3. These are the lines that we will sew on, and they are in the sequence that we will sew on. So we will start with sew line 1, and you would sew directly on the line. You'll also begin and end your stitching about 1/4 inch beyond this actual sew line that's drawn. So for sew line 1, I would begin my stitching about 1/4 inch above it, and I would end my stitching beyond the dashed line, because the dashed line indicates the cut line of the template. This is a finished paper pieced pattern. You can see that I've got lots of fabric hanging out beyond the paper pattern itself. It hasn't been trimmed down yet. You can also see that I've stitched on each one of the sew lines in the sequence that is given to me on the pattern. My next step, if I were to finish this, would be to cut on the dashed line and trim the pattern down to its appropriate size, which is 6.5 by 9.5. This is a finished unit, already trimmed and ready to be pieced into my quilt top next week. I don't want to remove any of the paper until I have pieced this unit into my quilt top next week. That is very important. Let's get started with paper piecing. Right, to start my first unit, I take one of my Xerox pages. Notice on the print side, this is the side I'm going to sew on again, and the blank side is where I'm going to place my fabrics. The first thing I want to do is cut off some of this excess paper around beyond the dash lines. So I'm just going to go ahead and whack off some of this extra paper. I don't need it. And that makes my unit a little easier to handle. The next thing I'm going to do is to start to place my fabrics in the sequence that is mentioned here. So 1 is a black piece, but I need to place my fabrics on the opposite side of the pattern. So what I'm going to do is turn it around, and I can kind of see the solid lines of that 1 shape coming through the pattern right there. You can also hold this up to a window. I'm going to take my first black strip and place it right over so it overlaps the one shape. And if I turn it this way, you can see that I am got my fabric in place, and it is actually over the shape that is labeled 1. I'm going to pin that in place for a minute. And the next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to place a white shape, or the number 2 shape, but I need to place it along the sew line, right sides together with the first black piece of fabric. So how do I know where to place my fabric? I'm going to take a couple pins and I'm going to pin right through onto this sew line. And I'll show you what this does. It creates a guide for me on the other side. So if I turn over to this side, you'll see that I've got pins showing through right here, if you can see them, right there and right there. And those pins are going at an angle, and that's the angle of that first sew line. So what I need to do is follow that angle when I put my next piece, which is white, right sides together with the black piece. So I'm not going to put it like this. I'm going to actually put it right sides together, and I'm angling it at the same angle that I see the pins going. You can also draw this line in if that helps. So I put it over there. I want to make sure that the edge of my white strip is about a ½ inch beyond these pins that are showing through. And you can see I've got it angled like that. What I'm going to do next is simply go over to this side, remove my pins off the sew line, and move them over to hold both pieces of fabric in place. So now I'm going to go over to my sewing machine, and you'll see I'm going to sew on this line that says sew 1, and I've got both my pieces of fabric in place, right sides together on the opposite side of the paper piece pattern. I'm now at my sewing machine. I place the entire unit underneath the needle. Remember, I'm going to start about a ¼ inch above the actual sew line, sew 1, and I'm just going to sew directly on that line, all the way down. You can go ahead and remove these pins if they're in your way, or just leave them in place, and you're going to sew all the way beyond the dash line. I now bring the unit back to the cutting board, and I'm going to have to trim off all of that excess fabric. So I remove all of my pins, and this is where it gets a little tricky, this first one. So what I need to do is I'm going to remove some of the extra fabric that is underneath here. So the way I do that is I flip the unit 180 degrees, so now everything is upside down to me, and I'm going to peel the paper pattern back towards the left. If you're left-handed, you would do the opposite way. I'm right-handed. So you can see I just simply flipped and kind of folded the paper pattern away from the fabric. You want to make sure that you've got the remainder of your pattern. You'll know you're doing this right, 1, if the numbers are upside down to you, and 2, if you're flipping the larger part of the paper pattern to your left, if that makes sense. I now take my ruler, I put the ¼ inch line on the edge of that paper, and what I'm going to do is trim away this extra fabric, leaving only a ¼ inch seam allowance. That reduces the bulk under here. You can also use an add a quarter ruler. That's a nice thing that's sold at your quilt shops, and that makes doing this trimming super easy. So you can see I just trimmed away all that extra fabric. I remove my ruler, and I'm going to actually take this now over to the iron and press the white piece outward like that. And those are my first 2 spikes. So here are my first 2 spikes. I'm ready to add my 3rd piece of fabric in place. And according to the pattern, my 3rd piece should be a black fabric. What I need to do now is place the 3rd piece of fabric right sides together with pieces 1 and 2. So again, in order to not guess at what the angle is, I'm going to pin right on the sew line. I'm creating myself a guide to look at when I turn this paper pattern over to the other side. So when I turn this paper pattern over, you can see I've got pins showing through right here, and right here. They're creating a line right across the black and white pieces that are there. I take my third piece, which is a black piece of fabric. I'm going to place it right sides together, right there, over those pins showing through. I'm going to extend it about a 1/2 inch beyond, and now I'm going to go back to my sewing machine and sew on the second sew line. I can remove the pins now that I have that black piece in place and pin through all 3 layers just like that. And again, I'm going to sew right down sew line number 2 now. At the sewing machine, doing my second sew line, again, I'm going to start a 1/4 inch beyond the dash line of the pattern and just sew straight as can be right on that line all the way through all those layers, removing pins if I need to, and beyond the dash line. Coming back to the cutting board again, I've now sewn on sew line 2, and I need to trim away the excess before I press this out. So again, I flip the pattern 180 degrees. I fold back on that sew line 2 that I just sewed, and I'm going to actually cut away all of this extra fabric to reduce the bulk. Again, I put my ruler a 1/4 inch line on the actual edge where the paper is folded back, and I trim everything away. So all of that gets trimmed away. And when I flip this back out, notice that I'm not cutting the paper when I do this. I'm only cutting fabric. I'll take this over to my pressing board and press that, and I've got the first and the second black and the first white spike right there. So it's starting to take shape. Now I just keep repeating this process until I have filled out the entire paper piece pattern or finished with sew line 10. So again, I've done 3 units so far on this, and the next one I need to add according to my pattern is a white piece, which is going to be number 4, or piece number 4. Again, I'm going to sew on sew line number 3 now. So I need to pin on sew line number 3, so I give myself another guide on the other side of this paper piece pattern in order to place my next strip right sides together at the correct angle. When I turn it over, I can see right on the black, there's some pin marks right here and here. They're creating an angle that goes like that, and I know exactly where to place my next strip. Right sides together, follow that angle, turn it back over this way, unpin off your sew line to the side so that everything stays put when you take this to your machine. Now go back to your machine and sew on sew line number 3. Start a 1/4 inch beyond the sew line, sew directly on the line, sew directly beyond the dash line, remove the pins, cut away the excess by turning the pattern 180 degrees, fold back the paper pattern on the sew line you just sewed or on sew line number 3. Take your ruler, line it up, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance, cut away extra fabric. Don't cut the paper. If you cut the paper, you've made a mistake. Unfold the paper, turn it back over to the other side, and fold out the next piece of fabric. I now have 4 pieces of fabric. I'm ready to add my 5th, which is my black, and continue on until I fill up the paper piece pattern or complete it. And there you go. That is a finished paper piece unit. You can see I've got all this extra excess fabric beyond this, and I need to cut it now and trim it to its proper size. And that's what the dashed lines indicate. So I'm going to trim on those dashed lines. If I've got my Xeroxing right to begin with, this unit should measure 6.5 by 9.5 once I trim on the dashed lines. Once you're done trimming down, leave the paper in place. That's very important until we get to next week, where we're going to put all these units together to complete our quilt top. So thanks so much for joining us this week for week number 4 of the Feelin Groovy QuiltAlong. Next week, week number 5, our final week, we'll be putting all of our elements together to complete our quilt top. Thanks so much for joining us, and until then, happy quilting, everybody.